Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating contrast hidden within two of the most deeply studied ancient texts in human history. On one hand, we've got the dense, sweeping prophecies of Isaiah, a text just absolutely bursting with geopolitical tension and cosmic drama. And then on the other hand, we have the incredibly intimate, deeply personal letters of John. Structurally, these documents seem worlds apart. Honestly, it's kind of like comparing a massive, sweeping war epic to a quiet, handwritten diary. Yet, as we'll see when we really look closely at the source material, they reveal profound, almost mind-blowing literary symmetry.
So you might be wondering, what exactly is the connection here? It's like a giant literary puzzle, and it's the central question we're answering today. How does an ancient Old Testament prophet's warnings about massive empires and warfare align with the New Testament apostles' hyper-focused instructions on individual compassion and brotherly love? Okay, let's dive into this. To understand it, we really have to look at the unique mechanics of how these two distinct texts define the human struggle and ultimately its resolution.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the two visions of these texts. Then, we'll move into Isaiah's theme of rebellion and judgment, contrast that with John's light versus darkness, and then hit the turning points, Isaiah's prophecies of restoration, and finally, John's command to love. It's a clear, straight path to connecting these ancient writings.
Section 1. Two visions of ancient texts, micro versus macro. Let's look at these texts impartially right now. Isaiah is operating on a massive macro scale. We're talking entirely consumed with nations, geopolitics, and sweeping cosmic judgments. It's basically a wide-angle lens on human history. John, however, he zooms all the way in. His microvision zeroes in on individual morality and inner spiritual light, and literally how you treat the person standing right in front of you. It's the ultimate contrast of a macro versus a micro lens. Section 2. Isaiah's rebellion and judgment. Let's set up the massive societal problem this prophet was dealing with. Isaiah kicks off his text by diagnosing a staggering, deep-rooted sickness within the kingdom of Judah. As the source material beautifully but tragically puts it, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, they have forsaken the Lord." Isaiah is describing a nation where the entire societal head is sick and the whole heart is faint. The rebellion he's talking about isn't just a personal failing, it's systemic, it's national, and it's completely devastating to their society. And honestly, a feeling of systemic societal sickness might sound surprisingly familiar today, depending on what news channel you're tuned into. But here's the thing. Isaiah doesn't just stop with Judah. He unleashes these immense geopolitical warnings, which the text refers to as burdens, against the surrounding global superpowers. The dramatic scale here is absolutely overwhelming. Babylon faces utter destruction, destined literally never to be inhabited again. Moab is laid waste. Egypt's waters dry up under a fierce king. And the great merchant city of Tyre is just completely forgotten for 70 years. Isaiah's canvas is the entire known world, making the point that absolutely no empire is immune to the consequences of corruption and arrogance. Now, Isaiah uses a really fascinating metaphor here called the rod of anger. In chapter 10, he describes the terrifying Assyrian Empire not just as some random conquering force, but as a divine tool, a literal rod used to execute cosmic judgment. But, and this is absolutely crucial, because Assyria acts out of its own brutal arrogance, it too will face ruin. It's a profound, objective look at how the text explains the cyclical rise and fall of violent empires throughout human history. Section 3. John's light versus darkness. We're pivoting completely away from the bloody battlefields of Isaiah now. We move to the quiet internal warnings of John's letters. He establishes his argument with this foundational, blindingly stark duality. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Wow. He leaves absolutely zero gray area there. For John, the entire spectrum of human existence is boiled down to these two opposing forces. You are either existing in the light or you are entirely consumed by the darkness. So what does that actually look like? For John, walking in light means having fellowship, actively doing the truth, and above all else, loving your brother. Conversely, walking in darkness isn't about failing to conquer a rival nation on a battlefield. It's about lying, harboring hatred, and suffering from spiritual blindness. The battleground has totally shifted from the geopolitical borders we saw in Isaiah right to the internal landscape of the human heart.
And just as Isaiah warned of external, national threats like Assyria, John warns of internal, spiritual threats. He outlines these very strict criteria for false prophets and antichrists. These are deceivers who deny that Jesus is the Christ,
who deny the Father and the Son, and who refuse to confess that Christ came in the flesh. For John, the invading army isn't crossing a geographical border. The invading army is a deception entering your mind.
Section 4, Isaiah's prophecies of restoration. This brings us to a massive turning point in our explainer. After diagnosing such severe problems, both of these sources pivot to profound hope. Isaiah introduces a defining concept for the arc of redemption, Emmanuel. This ancient Hebrew word simply translates to God with us. It's introduced in chapter 7 as a sign given to the house of David, a child born to a virgin. Just think about that stunning juxtaposition for a second. In the midst of terrifying geopolitical crises and impending army invasions, the ultimate promise that divine presence hasn't abandoned humanity comes in the form of a vulnerable, newborn child.
This promise is then expanded into what's honestly one of the most famous poetic sequences in ancient literature. Isaiah prophesies a coming king to counter all the chaos, and he gives him these incredible titles: Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Where human kings brought oppression and endless war, this promised figure brings perfect, eternal governance and justice.
And that new governance results in this totally iconic vision of cosmic restoration. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. This is Isaiah's ultimate, world-altering solution. The very instruments of death and warfare are physically transformed into tools of agriculture and life. The geopolitical nightmare finally ends in total systemic peace.
Section 5, John's command to love. Let's see how this global peace translates down to the micro level.
To solve the problem of human darkness, John uses a pretty heavy theological term, propitiation. Basically, it means the act of satisfying divine justice. John explains that God sent Jesus Christ to be the propitiation not just for a select few, but for the sins of the whole world. This, right here, is the text's precise mechanism for cleansing humanity's internal darkness, making real fellowship with the light actually possible.
And I love this part. John immediately anchors this intimate theology straight back to ancient history. He writes, "I write no new commandment unto you, but an old commandment which ye had from the beginning." John is explicitly telling us that his micro-level focus on love isn't some new invention. It's the exact same unbroken thread woven through ancient texts like Isaiah.
John then constructs this brilliantly logical, step-by-step philosophical argument for how to actually live this out. Step 1, God manifested love by sending his Son. Step 2, well, if God so loved us, we logically ought to love one another. Step 3, it's by loving each other in practical, everyday ways that God's love is actually perfected within us. And Step 4, this perfected love ultimately casts out fear. It's just a completely actionable narrative of personal transformation.
Which brings us to the definitive, climactic thesis of John's entire message. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If Isaiah's thesis was that God is the sovereign judge of nations, John's thesis is that the fundamental, elemental nature of God is love itself. You literally cannot claim to know the divine if you harbor hatred for the person sitting in the cubicle next to you or living across the street.
When we put these two fulfillment visions side by side, the duality is truly beautiful. Isaiah's fulfillment relies on nations finding peace, where tools of war are melted down into tools of growth. John's fulfillment relies on individuals finding peace, where the torment of fear is entirely cast out by perfect brotherly love. They are tracing the exact same arc of redemption, just from entirely different altitudes.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. If an ancient prophet staring down the violent Assyrian Empire and a beloved apostle dealing with internal community deception both conclude that the ultimate end goal of human existence is peace, truth, and perfected love, how does that unified literary message change the way we engage with these ancient sources today? It's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep exploring the sources, and I'll see you next time.